My pastor told me to forgive my cheating husband until I found out he was involved too. The day Nkiruka found the second phone, she was not even looking for it. She was searching for her husband's car keys because he had asked her to move the car before the rain came. The keys were not in the bowl by the door. They were not on the kitchen counter. She checked his coat pocket, and that is when her fingers closed around something smooth and flat and cold. She pulled it out thinking it was the keys. It was not the keys. It was a phone. A phone she had never seen before. A phone with no name on it, no case, no scratch. A phone that looked brand new and deliberately hidden. She stood there in the hallway of her own home, rain beginning to drum against the roof, and she felt her stomach drop so fast it was like the floor had given way beneath her. She did not open it, not yet. She put it back exactly where she found it, walked to the kitchen, sat down at the table, and stared at the wall for a very long time. If you have ever had that moment where you know something terrible is true, before you even have proof, you will understand exactly what Nkiruka was feeling in that kitchen. Stay with me, because this story is going to take you places you are not expecting. And if you are new here, consider subscribing now, because the stories we tell on this channel will stay with you long after they are over. Nkiruka Obiechina was 34 years old. She was born in Nwe, the second daughter of a tailor and a woman who sold fabric at Eke in Nwe Market. She had grown up watching her mother negotiate and smile and survive, watching her father measure cloth with steady hands, and she had absorbed both qualities without knowing it. She was precise, she was patient. She was the kind of woman who did not speak until she had thought, who did not act until she was certain. People often mistook her quietness for weakness. That was their first mistake. She had met her husband, Obiora Obiechina, when she was 26. He was 30 at the time, a civil engineer who had just returned from working in Abuja and was building a name for himself in Anambra State. He was handsome in that particular way that Igbo men can be handsome, broad-shouldered and clean-faced, with eyes that held laughter even when he was serious. He had come to her father's shop to commission a ceremonial outfit for his cousin's traditional marriage, and he had seen Nkiruka behind the counter, cataloging new lace samples, and he had not left for 2 hours. He kept asking questions about fabrics he did not care about. She knew what he was doing. She let him do it. They married 2 years later in a ceremony that lasted 3 days and was talked about in 3 villages for a year after. For the first 4 years, life was generous. Obiora's firm secured a government contract for road construction in Oka, and the money came in steadily. They built a house in GRA Onitsha, a proper house with a compound and a gate and a generator that actually worked. They had 2 children, a son, Ugochku, who was 5, and a daughter, Somkene, who was 3. Nkiruka had paused her fashion design business to raise the children, but she kept her hand in it, taking small orders, building her client list slowly. She was in no rush. She was 34. There was time, or so she believed. The changes in Obiora started small. She told herself that later, when she was trying to understand how she had not seen it sooner. But the truth was, she had seen it. She had simply explained every sign away with the reasonable explanations that love and trust provide. He started coming home later. She blamed the contract deadline. He started keeping his phone face down on every surface. She told herself it was a habit, that many people did it without meaning anything by it. He started being kinder to her, more attentive, bringing her food from a restaurant she liked, rubbing her shoulders in the evening without being asked. She should have known. A guilty man's kindness is not tenderness, it is payment. He was paying a debt she did not know existed. But she accepted the kindness. She was grateful for it. And the warmth of it made her suspicious thoughts feel small and mean, like she was a woman who could not simply accept her husband's affection without poisoning it with doubt. It was her friend, Ugoma, who first said the word out loud. Ugoma Ezenwachi was her friend since secondary school. She was a loud, blunt, fearless woman who worked as a nurse at the state teaching hospital and had the bedside manner of someone who had long ago run out of time for pretense. They were sitting in Nkiruka's living room one evening, the children asleep, eating chin-chin and watching a Nollywood film, When Ugoma paused the TV and turned to Nkiruka with that particular expression, the one that meant she had been holding something in for too long and could no longer carry it. Ugoma said, "I'm going to say something and I need you to hear me without getting angry." Nkiruka said nothing. She waited. Ugoma said, "Obiora is seeing someone." Nkiruka did not flinch. She did not cry. She asked Ugoma what she had seen. Ugoma told her. She had seen Obiora's car parked outside a guest house on the Oka-Onitsha Expressway on a Tuesday afternoon when she was driving back from a home visit. She had driven past slowly. The car was definitely his. The number plate, she had seen it twice before on different Tuesdays, but she had told herself it could be explained. Then she saw him coming out of the guest house with a woman. He did not see Ugoma. The woman was young, very young, and she was laughing at something Obiora said, leaning into him with the ease of someone who had been leaning into him for a long time.
Nkiruka listened to all of this. Then she said, "Thank you for telling me." Ugoma looked at her with worried eyes. "That is all you are going to say?" Nkiruka said, "For now, yes." She went home that night and she sat with the information the way she sat with difficult things, quietly, turning it over, examining it from every angle. She did not confront Obiora, not yet. She waited. She watched. She looked for the hidden phone she did not yet know existed. And then 3 weeks later, there it was, cold and flat in his coat pocket, giving her fingers the worst answer they had ever found. She did not tell Ugoma about the phone right away. Instead, she went to church. This is important because Nkiruka was not a woman who went to church whenever she was in crisis. She was a consistent worshipper. She went every Sunday. She attended midweek service when she could. She was a member of the Women's Fellowship. Her faith was not a crisis tool. It was her foundation. But on the day after she found the phone, she went to see her pastor, not as a desperate woman seeking a miracle, but as a woman who believed her spiritual leader deserved to know what was happening in the homes of her congregation. Pastor Cornelius Nwachipu led the Living Waters Apostolic Church of Onitsha, a congregation of about 300 families. He was 52, short and wide, with a full beard that was going grey at the edges, and eyes that carried an intensity his smile tried to soften. He had married Obiora and Nkiruka himself. He had prayed over Ogochukwu when the boy had a fever at 7 months that the hospital could not bring down. He was, in the vocabulary of their community, a man of God, which meant he was trusted with the most private matters of people's lives. She sat across from him in his office, which smelled of cedar and old books, and she told him everything. The late nights, Ogoma's sighting, the hidden phone. She did not cry as she told it. She watched him as she spoke. His face moved through a series of expressions she catalogued carefully: concern, sorrow, and something else, something she could not immediately name. Something that looked like he already knew and was deciding how much to know. She told herself she was imagining it. She trusted this man. She told herself what she was seeing was a pastor's practiced gravity, the learned solemnity of a man who absorbed difficult confessions daily. He listened until she was done. Then he prayed with her. Then he said the thing that would, months later, become the sentence she could not forgive. He said, "Sister Nkiruka, I want you to do something very difficult. I want you to forgive your husband before you confront him. Forgiveness before confrontation is the foundation of healing. Go home, create a space of peace. Let God work first." She looked at him for a long moment. She said, "And if he is still seeing this woman?" He said, "Pray. Trust God. Your marriage is worth fighting with prayer, not with accusations." She left his office and drove home in silence, her hands steady on the wheel, her mind doing something that was not quite thinking. It was more like measuring,
measuring distance, measuring time, measuring the weight of what had just been asked of her. She tried, give her that. For 3 weeks after that visit, Nkiruka Obiechina tried to be the woman her pastor asked her to be. She cooked Obiora's food. She smiled when he came home. She prayed every morning on her knees by the side of their bed, while Obiora snored beside her, and the words of the prayers felt like stones in her mouth because she could not push past the image of him walking out of that guest house, the woman laughing against his shoulder. But she tried. Obiora, for his part, noticed the softness in her and misread it entirely. He thought she was in a good mood. He thought things were fine. He did not know he was walking through a house where the woman he had married was systematically collecting evidence while appearing to have done nothing. Because that is who Nkiruka was. Patient, precise. She had found a way to unlock the hidden phone. It had taken her 2 weeks. She had done it by paying attention, watching his hands when he thought she was watching the television, noticing the pattern of his fingers, waiting until one night when he fell asleep on the couch and the phone was in his shirt pocket and the house was quiet and the children were in bed and all the stars in the sky above Onitsha were witnesses. What she found on that phone broke the version of the story she had been living. It was not a simple affair. It was older and more deliberate than that. The woman's name was Ifesinachi Duru. She was 28. She was not from Onitsha. She was from Uli, and she had come to Onitsha 2 years ago for work, and she had been placed. This is where it got strange. She had been placed in a job at the church's administrative office. She was the woman who handled donations and correspondence for Pastor Cornelius Nwachukwu's church. She had been there 18 months, and the messages between Obiora and Ifesinachi went back 14 months, which meant this affair had been running for over a year, in the church, under the nose of the pastor. Or so she assumed in those first terrible moments of reading message after message on the small, cold screen. She assumed the pastor did not know. She assumed Ifesinachi had found Obiora through the church network and the connection was a coincidence of geography. She was not ready for what the messages told her next, because buried between the love messages and the meeting arrangements and the things she could not make herself read twice, there was a thread, a set of messages that were different in tone, more careful, more coded, written in the language of two people who are being discreet, not with each other, but with a third party. Ifesinachi had written in one message, "He says we need to be more careful, that people are starting to notice your car." And Obiora had written back, "He is right, we will use Ezineth's place instead." She read that several times. He says, he is right. There was a third person in this arrangement, someone who knew, someone who was advising them, someone who had a stake in their discretion. She put the phone back. She lay in bed until morning. She did not sleep. When the children woke and came to find her, she held them in the blue-gray light of early morning, and she thought, I need to know everything before I do anything. Because if she was right about what she was beginning to suspect, if the person who told her to forgive, who had counseled patience, who had prayed over her marriage with holy hands raised to the ceiling, if that person was the same person advising her husband and his mistress on how to be more careful, then the ground she had been standing on was not ground at all, and she would need to know exactly how deep the hole went before she stepped off the edge. She went back to Goma. She told her everything. The phone, Ifesinachi, the messages, the mysterious he. Ugoma sat so still while Nkiruka talked that she looked like a photograph of herself. When Nkiruka finished, Ugoma said, in a voice that was almost no voice at all, "Nkiruka, I need to tell you something I should have told you before." The air in the room changed. "I saw Pastor Cornelius," Ugoma said, "at the same guest house, not with Obiora, alone going in. I did not think anything of it at the time because men of God go to meetings, they see people, the guest house has a restaurant. But I wrote it down in my diary because I write everything down. 2 months ago, a Friday afternoon, silence. The kind of silence that comes after something is said that cannot be unsaid. Nkiruka looked at her friend. She said, "What date?" Ugoma went and got her diary. She read out the date. Nkiruka took out her phone. She opened the calendar. On that same date, 2 months ago, Pastor Cornelius had told his congregation during a Sunday service that he had been on a retreat for prayer and fasting that week. That he had been in the mountain, he had said, meaning one of those spiritual retreat centers in Enugu. He had described the experience in vivid detail. The cold mornings, the Bible passages he had dwelt on, the peace of God that had descended on him. He had made the congregation weep with the beauty of it. But on the Friday of that week, 2 months ago, at around 2 in the afternoon, he had been seen going into a guest house on the Oka-Onitsha Expressway. The same expressway, the same guest house. If you are still watching this, and I know you are, I want to pause here and just say this. Sometimes, the people we trust with our most private ones are not just failing to protect us. Sometimes, they are the wound. And this is the point in our story where Nkiruka stops being a woman trying to save her marriage and becomes something else entirely. Subscribe if you haven't, because what happens next is the kind of thing that will keep you up at night, thinking about loyalty and God and the terrible uses of trust. Nkiruka needed proof. Not the kind of proof that makes a woman cry, the kind of proof that makes a room go quiet. She was precise, remember. She did not run, she planned. She and Ugoma sat in that sitting room and they planned together, the way women plan when they have nothing left to lose but the truth. Ugoma had a colleague at the hospital, a lab technician named Bamara, whose boyfriend was a private investigator. Not the Hollywood kind, the Onitsha kind, which is to say, a man named Chukudera Nuwosi, who drove a unmarked Toyota Camry, wore plain clothes, charged reasonable rates, and had been doing discreet domestic investigations for 11 years. Ugoma called Amara. Amara called Chukudera. Nkiruka met with him the next morning at a small restaurant near the main market. She did not tell him everything. She told him enough. She needed to know if a man named Cornelius Nwachukwu, who led a church in GRA, had a connection to a woman named Ifesinachi Duru, who worked at that church. She needed to know the nature of the connection. She needed it documented. Chukudera nodded slowly and said it would take 2 weeks. He would need 5% of his fee upfront. She paid it without blinking. She drove home. She cooked dinner. She served her husband. She watched him eat. He told her about his day. She said, in all the right places. She was somewhere else entirely. The 2 weeks that followed were the strangest of her life. She was living 2 lives simultaneously, the surface life of a wife and mother and church member, and the underground life of a woman who was quietly pulling a thread that she was terrified would unravel something too large to survive. At church that following Sunday, she sat in her usual pew, 4 rows from the front. She watched Pastor Cornelius preach. He was magnificent, as always. His voice rose and fell with the practiced skill of a man who had learned exactly when to shout and when to whisper, who knew that silence in a sermon is more powerful than noise. He preached that day about Joseph in the pit, about how the people who throw you into the pit are sometimes the very people God uses to position you for your purpose. The congregation was on its feet. She applauded with them. She smiled at the right moments. She met his eyes once across the room, and he nodded at her with the warm authority of a shepherd, and she nodded back with the stillness of a woman who had already made her mind. Ifesinachi Duru, she observed now with new eyes, sat at the side table near the sound booth, as the admin staff always did. She was pretty in an understated way, neat and composed, dressed in a plain blue blouse that Sunday, her lace head tie tied with precision. She did not look at Obiora doing the service. Obiora did not look at her. They were very good at this. The discipline of it told her that this had been running for a long time. You do not get that good at not looking at someone without a great deal of practice. Chukwudera called her on a Thursday, exactly 13 days after their meeting. He said he had what she needed. She met him at the same restaurant. He slid a manila envelope across the table. She opened it. She looked at the photographs one by one. She looked at the documents, call logs, location data, a receipt from the guest house in the name of a company that, when she looked it up, turned out to be registered to a man whose name she recognized immediately. It was not Obiora's name. The guest house visits, the bookings, the logistics of the affair, they had been facilitated and paid for through a company that belonged to Pastor Cornelius Noachukwu. His name was nowhere visible. The company was registered to his brother-in-law for a front. But Chukwudera went 3 layers deep, the way a good investigator does, and the trail came back to the pastor clearly and unambiguously. And the photographs? The photographs showed Cornelius and Ifesinachi together. Not in a restaurant, not in a meeting, together in a way that no pastor and his staff member should ever be. And there was more. There were photographs of Cornelius meeting with Obiora at a private residence in Akwa, a property Chukwudera had traced to a third party, sitting across a table and talking with the focused gravity of men making arrangements. They were not praying, they were not in Bible study, they were talking business. The kind of business that involves 2 men whose interests are tangled and who need to manage the risks of those tangles. Here is what Nkiruka understood now, looking at those photographs in that small restaurant, her palm flat on the table to stop her hand from shaking. This was not a simple case of a husband who had cheated and a pastor who had covered it up out of loyalty. This was a sharing arrangement. Ifesinachi Duru was not one man's mistress. She was, in a manner that turned Nkiruka's stomach, a woman who had been placed in the church office by Cornelius and who had subsequently become entangled with both men. Whether Ifesinachi had entered willingly or whether she had been maneuvered into it by 2 powerful men in her life, her employer and the husband of a church member, was a question Nkiruka could not answer from photographs alone. But the logistics told a story that was hard to misread. Ifesinachi had introduced Obiora to the guest house. Cornelius had paid for the initial visits. The messages on the hidden phone, "He says we need to be more careful," were messages about Cornelius managing the operation from above. He had counseled Nkiruka to forgive and to wait and to pray, not because he believed in her marriage, but because a confrontation between Nkiruka and Obiora was a confrontation that would inevitably lead back to him. She sat with all of this for a day, 1 full day. She took the children to her mother's house in Inewi under the pretense of a visit, dropped them off, embraced her mother, accepted the food her mother pressed into her hands, drove back to Onitsha, and spent the night alone in the house making decisions. Not emotional decisions, calculated ones. She was a woman who sewed things together with precision. She had watched her father his entire life measure twice and cut once. She was going to cut once, and it was going to be clean. The confrontation with Obiora happened on a Saturday morning, 3 days later. She had chosen Saturday deliberately. The children were still at her mother's. Obiora had no site visits scheduled. The house was quiet. She made breakfast, fried eggs and toast, and tea, the breakfast he loved. And she set it on the table and she called him down. He came down in his sleep clothes, unsuspecting, and he sat at the table and he poured his tea, and he looked up and saw the manila envelope sitting beside his plate. His hand stopped. His eyes moved to her face. She was watching him from across the table. She said, "Open it." He said, "What is this?" She said, "Open it." He opened it. She watched his face as he went through the photographs one by one. She watched the color leave him. She watched something collapse behind his eyes. Not guilt, not shame, but the specific expression of a man who realizes that the story he thought he was controlling has been taken out of his hands entirely. When he got to the photograph of him and Cornelius at the guest house in Oka, he stopped. His jaw moved, but nothing came out. She said, I went to your pastor. I told him about you and Ife Sinachi. He told me to forgive and to pray. He told me to wait. He told me God was working. She let that sit. Then she said, he is sleeping with her too. You both are. And he has been managing it. The room bookings, the advice to be more careful, the company that paid for the guest house, it is his. The silence in that kitchen was so complete. She could hear the generator next door, the distant sound of a hawker on the road, a bird somewhere in the compound. Obiora said nothing. He put the photographs back in the envelope very slowly, as if tidying up meant something. She said, I do not need you to say anything right now. I need you to know that I know everything, all of it, and I need you to know that what happens next is not going to be quiet. He looked at her then. He said, Nkiruka. It was the only word he said, just her name. She said, do not. She stood up. She picked up her bag. She walked out of the kitchen, through the house, out of the gate, got in her car, and drove. She did not know where she was going for the first 10 minutes. Then she found herself on the road to Ugoma's house, and she drove there. And when Ugoma opened the door and saw her face, she simply stepped aside and let her in and put the kettle on without saying a word. That is a true friend, the kind that does not need a sentence. What Nkiruka did next was the part that people in 3 churches and 2 market squares would talk about for years. She did not go to the church leadership in a panic. She did not post on social media. She did not call Obiora's family or her own family and create chaos before she was ready. She gave Obiora 1 week. She told him she was giving him 1 week to go to Cornelius and to tell him that she knew, and to begin the process of dismantling whatever arrangement they had built. She told Obiora that if he did not do this, she would present the full evidence, photographs, documents, call logs, to the church's board of elders, to the diocese, and to every family member on both sides. She told him calmly. She did not threaten. She stated facts. There is a difference, and Obiora heard it immediately. Obiora went to Cornelius within 24 hours. She knew he would. But what she did not know, could not have known, was what Cornelius would do next. Because Cornelius Nwachukwu had not built a ministry of 300 families and a personal wealth that included property in 3 states by being a man who panicked. He was a strategist, and his strategy, when confronted with exposure, was not remorse, it was counter-narrative. He called Nkiruka. He asked her to come and see him. She went because she wanted to watch his face. He greeted her in his office with sorrow and gravity, and the language of a man deeply wounded by accusation. He said that the photographs were misleading. He said that Ife Sinachi had come to him for counseling and that he had been trying to help her exit an unhealthy attachment to a married man, meaning Obiora. He said that his presence at the guest house was for a ministry meeting that happened to be held there. He had receipts, he said. He could explain everything. He was the real victim here, he said, of a misunderstanding that had grown to monstrous proportions. And then, and this is the moment that defined everything, he said gently, with his eyes full of a manufactured sadness, Nkiruka, I think you are under spiritual attack. The enemy uses our pain to see things that are not there. I think you should fast and pray before you take any action you cannot undo. She looked at him for a very long time. She thought of all the women who had sat in this chair before her, all the women who had come in pain and been sent home with prayers and patience, who had forgiven things that required more than forgiveness, who had swallowed their own evidence because a man with a Bible in his hand told them their eyes were lying. She thought of her children. She thought of her father at his table with his measuring tape. She thought of her mother at the market, smiling and negotiating and surviving. And then she said, very quietly, I have everything, Pastor. Not photographs that can be explained, financial records, a company traced to you, affidavits. I have retained a lawyer, and I have spoken to Ife Sinachi. She paused. She watched his face. She told me everything, she said. which was not entirely true at the time she said it, but became true 3 days later when Ifesinachi, realizing that the two men in her life had begun to position her as the fall in their shared story, called Nkiruka herself and asked to meet. So the statement was prophetic, if not yet factual. She stood up. She said, "I will see you on Sunday in front of the congregation." She walked out. The Sunday she is referring to did not go the way anyone planned. She had intended to stand up during open testimony, which Living Waters allowed at the end of service, and to speak. She had prepared what she would say. She had a copy of the key documents folded in her Bible. She had told Ugoma what she was going to do. Ugoma had said, "I will be sitting right next to you." What she had not anticipated was that Ifesinachi would arrive at church that Sunday morning looking like a woman who had decided to stop being afraid. Ifesinachi sat in her usual place by the sound booth, but before service began, she walked up to the front of the church and asked the microphone operator for the pulpit microphone. When he hesitated, she simply picked it up. Pastor Cornelius was still in his back office. He had not come out yet. His associate, a young man named Brother Obina, was leading the opening worship. The congregation fell quiet when they realized the woman holding the microphone was not on the program. Ifesinachi Duro stood in front of 300 families, and she said, in a voice that did not shake, "My name is Ifesinachi Duro. I have worked in this church for 18 months, and there are things this congregation deserves to know." The doors to the hall opened. Cornelius walked in. He saw her. He stopped. The entire church was watching. Nkiruka, 4 rows from the front, felt the air in the room change the way it changes before lightning. She gripped her Bible. Ugoma put a hand on her arm. Not to stop her, just to say, "I am here." What followed lasted 40 minutes. It was not theatrical. It was not a performance. It was the kind of confession that comes from someone who has decided that the cost of silence is higher than the cost of truth. Ifesinachi told the congregation about Cornelius. She told them how he had groomed her after she took the job, slowly at first until she was dependent on him professionally and emotionally before she understood what was happening. She told them about Obiora, how Cornelius had introduced them at a church dinner, had encouraged the connection, had in fact facilitated the relationship between her and Obiora as a way of creating a shared secret that bound all 3 of them to silence. She had not understood it at the time. She was young and isolated and grateful for belonging, and by the time she understood what had been done to her, she was already too deep inside the secret to see the exit. She did not cry as she said this. Her voice stayed level. Cornelius tried twice to interrupt. Both times, members of the congregation told him to sit down. The second time, 3 elders physically put themselves between him and the microphone. He sat. His face was a mask that was cracking around the edges. Nkiruka watched him. She had put her Bible down. She did not need to stand up. This was no longer her story to tell alone. It belonged to everyone in that room now. And that was both a relief and a grief. The grief of a woman who had carried something so heavy for so long and felt her arms ache even after the weight was gone. After Ifesinachi finished, Nkiruka stood, not to testify, to confirm. She said only this: "Everything she has said is true. I have documentation. I will share it with the Board of Elders today. I came to this church a woman in pain looking for guidance. I was told to forgive and pray. I want every woman in this room to hear me when I say this. Forgiveness is yours to give on your own terms. It does not require you to be silent. It does not require you to stay. And no man of God has the right to use your faith as a tool to protect himself." The congregation was very quiet. Then a woman somewhere in the back began to weep, and the sound of it was somehow the most honest thing in the room. Cornelius Nwachukwu was suspended by the church's denominational body within the week, pending investigation. The investigation took 3 months. At the end of it, he was stripped of his pastoral credentials and removed from the church permanently. The story made the rounds in Onitsha and beyond. These things always do. Some people, even then, defended him. Some people said Ifesinachi was lying, that she had been rejected and seeking revenge. Some people said Nkiruka should have handled it privately, that she had disgraced the body of Christ. There will always be people who say these things. There will always be people who believe that the institution of the church or the institution of marriage is more important than the truth of what happens inside them. Nkiruka had decided, somewhere in those long nights before she acted, that she would not let anyone's opinion of her actions change the actions. She had been right. She had the proof. She had acted. That was enough.
Obiora moved out of the house in GRA. He did not fight it. There was no version of a fight that ended well for him, and he was intelligent enough to know it. They began the process of separation, quiet, legal, administered through a lawyer who was professional and expensive and worth every naira. Ugochukwu and Somkene stayed with Nkiruka. Obiora got regular access. He was a good father, whatever else he was. She did not take that from the children. She did not tell them stories that would poison them against their father. She only told them that things had changed, that their home would look different for a while, and that both their parents loved them and that would never change. Ugochukwu at 5 accepted this with the philosophical calm of a child who does not yet have the vocabulary for what he cannot understand. Somkene at 3 simply asked if Papa would still read bedtime stories when he came to visit. Nkiruka said yes, he did. Ifesinachi did not disappear after that Sunday. Nkiruka had expected her to recede back into whatever smaller life she had been living before all of this erupted. But Ifesinachi surprised her. 2 weeks after the church meeting, she called Nkiruka not to apologize, although she did apologize simply and without elaborate justification. She called to ask if Nkiruka knew of any organizations that helped women in situations like hers, women who had been used by men in positions of religious authority. Nkiruka did not know of any, but she told Ifesinachi she would find out. She made calls, she did research, she found a women's legal aid clinic in Enugu that dealt specifically with such cases. She passed the information along. 3 months later, she found out that Ifesinachi had joined the volunteer team at that same clinic. She was helping other women find the exits that no one had shown her. Nkiruka thought about that for a long time. The strange way that harm, when it is faced and named and survived, can sometimes become a doorway rather than a wall. Not always, not easily, but sometimes, if the person walking through it has a particular kind of courage.
Nkiruka's fashion business, which had been running quietly in the background of her marriage, expanded in the year that followed, partly because she had more time for it, partly because the clarity that comes after surviving something enormous has a way of sharpening your vision on everything else. She hired 2 apprentices, she took on bridal commissions, she collaborated with a Lagos-based designer who had heard about her work through a mutual contact and reached out with a proposal. The business grew in the practical, unglamorous, daily way that real things grow, through work and attention and showing up consistently. She did not become a celebrity overnight. She did not appear on television and give speeches about resilience. She simply kept walking. She kept sewing. She measured twice and cut once. The last time she saw Cornelius Onwachukwu, it was not by arrangement. She was in the market in Onitsha buying fabric, beautiful deep asoke in green and gold for a client's wedding, and she turned a corner between 2 stalls and there he was, broader now, the beard fully grey, dressed in a plain agbada with no pastoral identity attached. He saw her at exactly the same moment she saw him. They both stopped. The store between them was selling plastic housewares, buckets and bowls in bright colors, and the noise of the market went on around them indifferent to the stillness of their encounter. He opened his mouth. She did not wait to hear what he would say. She looked at him the way her mother had always looked at difficult customers in the fabric market, calmly, clearly, without malice, without drama, and she turned and continued walking. She bought her fabric, she haggled well, she carried it to her car herself. People sometimes ask, in the long hindsight of a story like this, whether Nkiruka forgave them, whether she forgave Obiora, whether she forgave Cornelius. It is a question that misunderstands what forgiveness is and what it requires. Forgiveness does not mean what happened was acceptable. It does not mean you have to maintain proximity with the person who harmed you. It does not mean you stop yourself from seeing clearly what was done to you and why. Real forgiveness, the Igbo grandmothers have a word for it, iwe pobi, which means to release it from your heart. It is not performed for the person who hurt you. It is done for yourself. You put down the weight not because they deserve it to be taken from them, but because you are tired of carrying it. Nkiruka came to this slowly. It took longer than she expected. There were mornings, even a year after everything, when the anger was still there, solid as furniture in the room, and she had to move around it carefully. But the mornings when it was not there grew more frequent, and then more frequent still. She was 36 now. The children were thriving, The business was growing, the house in GRA was hers, and it was full of lights and the smell of fabric and the sound of her children's voices and the hum of her sewing machine in the afternoon when the sun came through the window at that particular angle that made everything golden. She had told her mother everything eventually. Her mother had listened in the sitting room in Nwewi, hands folded in her lap, face still, the way she had always listened to difficult things. When Nkiruka finished, her mother said nothing for a long while. Then she said in Igbo, "The eye that sees clearly is not an arrogant eye, it is just a walking eye. You have always had walking eyes, my daughter. Use them." It was not comfort in the conventional sense, but Nkiruka understood it. She had always understood her mother's language. It was the language of a woman who built a life in a market, who had learned to read situations and people before they declared themselves, who had survived by seeing clearly and acting precisely and never pretending that what was in front of her was something other than what it was. Nkiruka was her mother's daughter. She had simply taken a longer road to remember it. There is a particular kind of community that forms among women who have been through the same fire. Not grief groups, not formal support, but the informal network of knowing looks and phone numbers passed quietly, and meals left at doors and children collected from schools when a woman needs her hands free. Ugoma was the center of it in their circle, as she had always been. Nkiruka became part of it in a new way after everything, not as a woman to be supported, but as one who could offer steadiness to others. She became that person who answered the phone at midnight. She became the person other women came to before they went to the pastor, which was a dark kind of joke that she allowed herself to find funny sometimes. She always listened. She always said, "Get the evidence before you make a move." She always said, "Your faith and your common sense are not enemies." She never told anyone what to do. She never told anyone to leave or stay. She told them, "See clearly first. Everything else comes after." Obiora remarried 2 years later. He told her when it happened, out of a courtesy she had not expected from him. The woman was from Lagos, a professional of some kind. Nkiruka wished him well and meant most of it. The children attended the introduction ceremony with their father and came home with jollof rice in takeaway containers and stories about the Lagos relatives who had never seen Anambra before and were genuinely afraid of the Onitsha traffic. Ugochukwu described it with the narrative relish of a boy who would someday be a compelling storyteller. Some Kine had strong opinions about the quality of the chin-chin at the ceremony. They were fine. They were better than fine. Children are more resilient than we expect when we love them loudly and lie to them rarely. The church that Cornelius had led eventually reorganized under new leadership. A younger pastor, a man from Aba who had come through a reputable seminary and had a wife who sat on the church board and who in general had the demeanor of someone who understood that accountability and holiness are not opposites. He took it over and rebuilt it carefully. Some families left. Some stayed and worked to restore what had been damaged. Nkiruka and her children continued attending for a while, then eventually found a smaller congregation closer to home that suited their new life better. She did not live in anger. She left the way you leave a house you have outgrown, not hating it, but needing more room. Ifesinachi, the last Nkiruka heard, was still at the Women's Legal Aid Clinic in Enugu. She had started a small, informal support group for young women in church employment, which had a careful, non-sensational name that said nothing about betrayal or scandal. It was named for a word meaning guidance. It had 30 members, then 80. By last report, 112. These things start quietly. They do not stay quiet, but they do not need to be loud to be powerful. And Nkiruka? Nkiruka sits sometimes in the evenings, after the children are in bed, at her work table in the room she has made into her studio, with the fabric spread under the light, and her pins and her measuring tape and her scissors, and she sews. There's something meditative about the repetition of it, the measuring, the cutting, the threading, the joining of disparate pieces into something that holds together. She learnt it watching her father, who learnt it from his own father, who is said to have made cloth in a village where no one else could afford thread. The act of making something beautiful out of separate pieces that did not begin as a whole. This is not a metaphor she allows herself too often, because she distrusts sentimentality and finds most metaphors about survival too neat. But in the late evenings, with the house quiet and the scissors in her hand and the fabric taking shape, she allows herself to feel the particular satisfaction of a thing done with precision. She allows herself to feel the weight of what she survived and the lightness of having survived it. She allows herself to think of her daughter asleep in the room above her and to feel the specific fierceness of a woman who has decided that the world her daughter grows into will know at least one example of a woman who saw clearly and acted carefully and did not let anyone use her faith against her. That is enough. That is more than enough. Some evenings, it feels like everything. If this story stayed with you, and I think it did, consider subscribing to this channel. Not for us, for you. Because we are here every week with stories like this one. Stories that are about real things: loyalty, betrayal, faith, survival, and the complicated, unglamorous, powerful work of becoming who you were always meant to be. The button is there. Take a second, and we will see you in the next story.